So after World War II, the US and the USSR were the only two nations with any power left. The United States was a lot stronger. We had atomic weapons, for starters, and also the Soviets had lost 20 million people in the war, and they were led by a sociopathic, mustachioed Joseph Stalin. But the US still had worries. We needed a strong, free market-oriented Europe, and to a lesser extent Asia, so that all the goods we were making could find happy homes. The Soviets, meanwhile, were concerned with something more immediate, a powerful Germany invading them again. Germany, and please do not take this personally, Germans, was very, very slow to learn the central lesson of world history: do not invade Russia, unless you're the Mongols. So at the end of World War II, the USSR encouraged the creation of pro-communist governments in Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, which was a relatively easy thing to encourage because those nations were occupied by Soviet troops. The idea for the Soviets was to create a communist buffer between them and Germany, but to the US it looked like communism might just keep expanding, and that would be really bad for us because who would buy all of our sweet, sweet industrial goods? So America responded with the policy of containment. Communism could stay where it was, but it would not be allowed to spread. And ultimately, this is why we fought very real wars in both Korea and Vietnam. As a government report from 1950 put it, the goals of containment were 1. Block further expansion of Soviet power, 2. Expose the falsities of Soviet pretensions, 3. Induce a retraction of the Kremlin's control and influence, and 4. In general, foster the seeds of destruction within the Soviet system. Harry Truman, who, as you'll recall, became president in 1945 after Franklin Delano Pres for Life Roosevelt died, was a big fan of containment, and the first real test of it came in Greece and Turkey in 1947. This was a very strategically valuable region because it was near the Middle East, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but the United States has been just like a smidge interested in the Middle East the last several decades because of oil, glorious oil! Right, so Truman announced the so-called Truman Doctrine because, why not name a doctrine after yourself, in which he pledged to support, quote, freedom-loving peoples against communist threats. The Truman Doctrine created the language through which Americans would view the world, with America as free and communists as tyrannical. According to our old friend Eric Foner, the speech set a precedent for American assistance to anti-communist regimes throughout the world, no matter how undemocratic, and for the creation of a set of global military alliances directed against the Soviet Union. It also led to the creation of a new security apparatus, the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Atomic Energy Commission, all of which were somewhat immune from government oversight and definitely not democratically elected. And the containment policy and the Truman Doctrine also laid the foundations for a military buildup, an arms race, which would become a key feature of the Cold War. But it wasn't all about the military, at least at first. Like, the Marshall Plan was first introduced at Harvard's commencement address in June 1947 by, get this, George Marshall. The Marshall Plan was a response to economic chaos in Europe, brought on by a particularly harsh winter that strengthened support for communism in France and Italy. The plan sought to use U.S. aid to combat the economic instability that provided fertile fields for communism. Basically, it was a New Deal for Europe, and it worked. Western Europe was rebuilt so that by 1950, production levels in industry had eclipsed pre-war levels, and Europe was on its way to becoming a US-style capitalist mass consumer society, which it still is. Kind of. Meanwhile, Germany was experiencing the First Berlin Crisis. And then, in 1948, Stalin cut off the roads to West Berlin. So the Americans responded with an 11-month-long airlift of supplies that eventually led to Stalin lifting the blockade in 1948 and building the Berlin Wall. 1949 did see Germany officially split into two nations, and also the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, and NATO was established, and the Chinese Revolution ended in communist victory. So by the end of 1950, the contours of the Cold War had been established. West versus East, capitalist freedom versus communist totalitarianism. The US government cast the Cold War as a rather epic struggle between freedom and tyranny, and that led to remarkable political consensus. Both Democrats and Republicans supported most aspects of Cold War policy, especially the military buildup part. Now, of course, there were some critics, like Walter Lippmann, who worried that casting foreign policy in such stark ideological terms would result in the US getting on the wrong side of many conflicts, especially as former colonies sought to remove the bonds of empire and become independent nations. But yeah, no, nothing like that ever happened. But these interventions were viewed as necessary to prevent the spread of communism, which was genuinely terrifying to people, and it's important to understand that. Like, national security agencies pushed Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies like The Red Menace, which scared people, and the CIA funded magazines, news broadcasts, concerts, art exhibitions that gave examples of American freedom. It even supported painters like Jackson Pollock and the Museum Museum of Modern Art in New York because American Expressionism was the vanguard of artistic freedom and the exact opposite of Soviet socialist realism. I mean, have you seen Soviet paintings? Look at the hardy ankles on these socialist comrade peasants. Also, because the Soviets were atheists, at least in theory, Congress in 1954 added the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance as a sign of America's resistance to communism. The Cold War also shaped domestic policy. Anti-communist sentiment, for instance, prevented Truman from extending the social policies of the New Deal. The program that he dubbed the Fair Deal would have increased the minimum wage, extended national health insurance, and increased public housing, Social Security, and aid to education. But the American Medical Association lobbied against Truman's plan for national health insurance by calling it socialized medicine, and Congress was in no mood to pay money for socialized anything. That problem goes away. But the government did make some domestic investments as a result of the Cold War. In the name of national security, the government spent money on education, research in science, technology like computers, and transportation infrastructure. In fact, we largely have the Cold War to thank for our marvelous interstate highway system, although part of the reason Congress approved it was to set up speedy evacuation routes in the event of nuclear war. And speaking of nuclear war, it's worth noting that a big part of the reason the Soviets were able to develop nuclear weapons so quickly was thanks to espionage. It's important to remember all that when thinking about the United States' obsessive fear that there were communists in our midst. This began in 1947 with Truman's loyalty review system, which required government employees to prove their patriotism when accused of disloyalty. How do you prove your loyalty? Rat out your coworkers as communists. No, seriously though, that program never found any communists. This all culminated, of course, with the Red Scare and the rise of Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, an inveterate liar who became enormously powerful after announcing in February 1950 that he had a list of 205 communists who worked in the State Department. In fact, he had no such thing, and McCarthy never identified a single disloyal American, but the fear of communism continued. In this climate of fear, any criticism of the government and its policies, or the US in general, was seen as disloyalty. We've talked a lot about different ways that Americans have imagined freedom this year, but this was a new definition of freedom. The government exists in part to keep us free from massive destruction. So the Cold War changed America profoundly. The US has remained a leader on the world stage and continued to build a large, powerful, and expensive national state, but it also changed the way we imagine what it means to be free and what it means to be safe. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.